this tutorial is going to be about the volume builder. We're entering a phase in terms of modeling where we're going to be looking at more ways to model organic forms more easily and some of the other modeling tools we haven't covered yet. And so to start with, we need to create a couple primitives. And these could be any object you want. I'm going to go ahead and just create a torus. And I'm going to create a cube. And I've created both of these objects for a reason. And that's just so that we can see how the volume builder reacts to different types of geometry. And so the first thing we're going to do is there's a couple different ways you can use the volume builder. And in this case, we're going to use it almost like a bool. And we'll look at the ways that this works and how it's different than working with the bool. So go ahead and position your objects. You can scale them a little bit if you want to. I'm going to make the ring diameter a little smaller and the actual, there we go, the diameter a little bigger so it sticks through there. But maybe, actually, I do want this to intersect with the sides here so we can see these angles too and what happens to them when we use the volume builder. And so the volume builder tools are available under the volume menu item at the top of the screen. And there's two main things. There's some other options in here too that we might not talk about all of them, but we're going to talk about a couple. So the first thing is the volume builder, and then there's the volume mesher. So let's go ahead and click on the volume builder, and let's just go ahead and make the torus a child of the volume builder. And when we do that, you'll notice that I get this crazy pixelated looking model. And what it's doing is it's taking the volume of the object that we're modeling, and it's turning it into a little voxels, right? Voxels are, you could imagine them as three-dimensional pixels, right? And if you've played Minecraft, right, it's basically what the whole world of Minecraft looks like and how it's built, right? And so it's a similar concept, right? So we have all these little tiny blocks. And so what it's doing is it's creating, it's filling the volume that we had. So let's go ahead. We can also add the cube to this volume builder. And it does not matter really right now whether it's the first child or the second child, just knowing that it is in there. And you'll see that the cube itself even looks a little bit different. But it is also built out of all of these little cubes. Now, what the volume builder allows us to do some really interesting things, but one of the things that we can do is we can use it to join objects. And so let's click on the volume builder object in our hierarchy, and let's look at some of these settings here. So I'll pull this up a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in. So first, you'll notice that there are two objects. Both of the objects I've put in here are in this field, and there is this mode option and the input type, which is child. Right? So one of the things that you can do with a volume builder that you can't really do easily with a bool is you can union, or you can basically put multiple objects together, and you can control the way in which each of those objects blends with the object below it in the hierarchy. Right? So right now, the cube and the torus are here, and the cube, because it's the top child, has this mode option. It's currently set to union, which means that they're united, right? They're one solid object now. If I go to subtract, then what that does is it's similar to a subtract b on the bool, right? It's taking the top object and subtracting the bottom child from it, right? Or sorry, it's doing it the opposite way. It's taking the base object, the torus, and it's subtracting the cube from it. If we do intersect, right, it's only going to be the areas where the cube and the torus intersect. Right, so there's just a few different options here. Let's go back to union for the time being. There's a couple different volume types. There's sign distance field, fog, and vector. We're not going to talk about vector today at all. We will look at sign distance field to start with, and then we'll also look at fog. If I just click on fog, the first thing you're going to notice is that it subdivides every one of these things, and basically every point becomes a really, really basically just a point, right? It's this hollow grid of points, or a fog of points, right? Whereas signed distance field looks more like a solid object. The next setting down is the voxel size. You can imagine this as your resolution, right? I'm currently in inches, which is horrible. I know one of you likes inches in the class, but I'm going to go ahead and very quickly go to my preferences. If you ever want to switch units, you just go to preferences and you go down to units and you say, go down to this unit display and change that to what you want. I'm going to go with millimeters, actually. That would be my perfect one. Okay, so if I come back over here, you'll see that the voxel size is set to 100 millimeters. Right, so that means each one of those cubes is 100 by 100 by 100 millimeters. If I open this up, there's a lot more settings there. We're not going to worry about those right now for some of the basics. But so something to note, I can make these voxels bigger and have a lower resolution model. So I could make this, 1,000, right? And I'm going to get just a blob because that's just way too big for the objects that I'm working with. If I make this 10, I'm going to get a much finer looking object. Notice you lose all of the phong on your objects that are in your hierarchy. And the phong is what makes that curvature where it's actually a faceted geometry. That's just something to be aware of. When you're working with voxel size, you need to be careful because the smaller your voxel is, the more voxels there are. And that means that it's going to take that much more time to move, to migrate, to make any changes, because it's deleting and updating and moving the position of, an order, in this case, an order of magnitude more voxels. But we'll look at how you can adjust that setting. So I'm going to set this back to 100, so it's just at the default, so we can see what's happening. So I've got those options. So now this is not something that I would necessarily want to render, right? In fact, if I try to render it, it doesn't show up at all. And that's because it doesn't have a skin, right? It doesn't have a mesh going over the outside of it. And the mesh is what gets rendered by Cinema4D. So I'm going to go back up to volume at the top of the screen. I'm going to go to volume mesher. And what I need to do to make this show up is I need to take my volume builder and I need to make it a child of my volume mesher. As soon as I do that, I get that normal gray material that we're used to seeing in Cinema4D when we have no material applied to our object. And you'll also notice that everything is very rounded, right? The corners are rounded. There's actually a reasonably smooth transition from this object to the next, right? It looks like a natural joint that potentially might have been made with, if you were using a soft modeling material like clay. So if I have these two pieces, let me go ahead and change my display to garage shading lines. So this is what the mesh grid looks like, right? One of the other nice things about this, and this is something that allows you to bring objects that you've made with the volume builder or that you've skinned with the volume builder after modeling them in a different way. It allows you to bring them into a tool we will be looking at soon called the sculpt mode for sculpting objects. And so it gives you nice even subdivisions that makes the sculpting go a lot more smoothly. So something else something else that we can adjust is let's go back to our volume builder and let's adjust the voxel size, right? So I'm going to go ahead and make this 50. And when I do that, you'll see that my polygon count on this surface increases, right? It's there should be twice as many or 4 times as many right now. If I go down to 10, right, my polygon count is really, really, really high, right? And so again, this is going to create, right, this is going to be ruinous to your computer if it doesn't have that much power. So I'm going to go back to 50 because 50 is a nice, for this object, it seems to be a nice smooth transition. Now, there's not really any good way to make these corners hard. That's something to note. You're always going to have some rounding. You're never going to have a hard, crisp seam between two objects using the volume builder. All right, so let's go ahead and go to the volume mesher and look at its settings really quickly. So the volume mesher only really has two settings, or three settings. There's a curvature map, which we can talk about later, that's more advanced, but there's the voxel range threshold, and there's this setting that just says adaptive. If I decrease the voxel range threshold, you'll see what happens, right? It's really shrinking the object down, or it's expanding it out and kind of ballooning around those voxels, right? So this gives me some ability to scale this, and you can see I can make everything, these corners, hard and crisp, but at the same time, anywhere there's a curve, I'm going to get a lot of noise on that surface. So let's set this back to 50, and let's look at the adaptive. So the adaptive is basically allowing us to control how many polygons there are on our surface, right? We can, if we make it 100%, it's going to reduce the polygon count to the lowest number possible, while still maintaining some semblance of this mesh, right? So this has, greatly reduced our polygon count. If I do that and then, adjust my voxel threshold, you can see kind of the effect that has as well. Right? I'm going to put that back to 50. Right? And if I go down to 0, that's full polygon count. You'll notice that when I do this, I get these crazy triangles and things. And so, if you're going to be doing more modeling, specifically sculpting, where all of these polygons meet at these individual points is going to be problematic. So I suggest if you're going to be modeling this further with the sculpt tools, don't set that down, or we'll either go all the way to 100% or we'll be at 0. Those are really the two options that will be the cleanest. This allows you to have a really low polygon object to start with that you can then create more subdivisions on top of and layers of sculpting. So we'll talk about that later, but we're going to leave this set here. So something else to note, while all of this is live, I can select either one of these objects and move them through the other object, right? And it will update in real time the position of these objects unless I just have far too much stuff going on. All right, so if I go ahead and do that, and let's go ahead and switch this back to subtract, and you can kind of see what happens now that we have these polygons counting. So you'll see that, right, there is some noise here on this surface, right? We get some jagged edges. It's not perfect. And one of the things we can do is we could decrease our voxel size some, say go down to 25, which is going to clean this up and make these edges more crisp. And then we can also use that volume mesher and the voxel range threshold, right? By even just increasing it 1%, you'll see that this edge that was a little bit bumpy before is cleaner now. Something else we can do is we can always take this, make it a simpler mesh, and put it in a subdivision surface, or create more subdivisions later to round this out. And so, again, you can see, right, if I really pull this in or pull this out, but just slight adjustments can create, somewhere in this 50s range, can create a much cleaner edge than was originally there. Right? And so this really makes it pretty easy to make interesting objects. So let's go ahead and select our object, our volume builder. If we want to adjust this, so we want the torus to be the first child and the cube to be the second child, we can either do it in our object hierarchy, or we can click in this field here and drop this down. Right? And so now the torus is, if I go to subtract, right, it'll actually cut that ring out of this block. Now there is there's one other thing that we need to look at, and when we do that, I'm going to go ahead and make this a union again, and I want to create a condition where there's some weirdness in the mesh. And so I'm going to actually increase my voxel size back to 50 and see if I can, what I'm trying to do is create a weird seam where these parts are. Maybe if I make this just a little bit bigger. All right, so in here it's gluing together, but there's a little bit of weirdness in there, and I'd like that to be a bit smoother. Conversely, right, I could always, subtract this out, and we could look at some of the issues inside, where there's some of this noise happening on the edge that we'd really like to have rounded, right? Whichever way, both of those places offer us an area to look at when we do this next step. So one of the other things that we can do is we can apply filters to the volume builder. And so one of the filters that we can create for this sign distance field is an SDF, or sign distance field smooth, right? And there's also dilated rows, open and close. We'll talk about those in a second. But let's go ahead and just click on here. And you can immediately see what happens when you do that, right? It immediately smooths out and basically makes all of these curves significantly more gentle. Now, when we do that, we create this filter here, which allows us to adjust that smoothness, right? So you'll see that, now it's completely rounded by default, and it allows me to adjust, from 0 to 100% smoothing. There are a couple different algorithms that you can try, and each one just creates a slightly different result, right? This is median. It's a little bit blockier. Gaussian is much rounder, right? Mean is somewhere in between those two. Mean curvature looks like it has a much finer impact on the surface. And if you increase the number of iterations, you can make that a stronger impact. And then the Lapation flow, again, if I just have one iteration, it's going to be less intense. And if I, increase and increase and increase, I can create several levels of smoothing. I accidentally just clicked and dragged on there. So that's 134 levels of smoothing, which would allow, for some interesting shapes to come out of this. But you can see that it's making my computer go really slow. So let's just say we do 25 levels and see what that gets us, right? So you do have the freedom to use this to really control the shape and the way that works. I'm going to crank this back up. I'm going to turn this SDF smooth setting off by unchecking it here. And then I'm going to go ahead and click on dilate and erode. And again, there's it basically offsets everything, right? So there's a 50 millimeter offset. If I do 100, right, it's going to boost it up. If I do -10, right, it should shrink it down, or -100, right? And again, this is just essentially taking the geometry and offsetting it a little bit. It might do, you can see if I do 2 iterations, it essentially applies that offset again. If I do 2 iterations, it applies it a 3rd time, right? So each one of these, and so if I was to say, make this offset 20 and then do these iterations, right, I can use that as a way to essentially inflate this geometry as well. All right, so I'm going to turn that off, and I want to show you the last option as well. Oops, I did not mean to put this on here. Is the close and open. And again, the offset is set. You can see that really this is only adjusting the areas where the connections happen, right? And so if I increase the number of iterations, again, I can smooth this. But again, it's not changing the volume of any of the other parts. It's just changing the rounding of the corners. If I was to set this, I don't know if you can set this to negative, honestly, I haven't tried. It looks like you can do -50, and it looks like it has a similar, a similar impact to positive numbers. Okay, So those are the three types of filters we can use with this sign distance field, which is what you want to use if you're trying to create a larger volume out of multiple objects, right? So, you can use this to really quickly model things from primitives that have a high number of planes and have really smooth, organic looking surfaces. So one last thing you can do is you can mix and match these different filters together, right? So if I did the dilate and erode, and if I said I want to do, let's do 3 iterations. So yeah, so if I do dilate and erode and I have that set to -50 as my offset, and I just set the number of iterations to 3, right? And then I have smooth on top of this, right? I can use this to essentially, at this point, that smoothing is controlling the intensity of the thing below it. Now, something else you'll note is that you can get some really interesting effects with how this geometry starts to spin out and trail off into like weird little blobs. And for the next part of the tutorial, we're going to look at other ways that you can make blobby things. But before we do that, let's go ahead and practice by trying to make something that that's actually interesting. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll just turn all of this off and hide it so that we know it's still there. But let's go ahead. I'd like you to go ahead and try and make just try and make a simple face with a few basic shapes. So I'm going to go ahead and have a capsule there. And I might just use a couple capsules actually to do this. Okay, so because I don't have a ton of time to continue to work on this before I have run out of time to do the tutorial, I'm just going to leave this model with these, I don't know, round-shaped ears, round-shaped eye blobs, and this curly nose on this basic capsule head. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create another volume builder, and you should all do this too. I'm going to select all my objects. I'm going to drop them in the volume builder, and I can already tell that my voxel size is way too big, so I'm going to set this to 25, which seems maybe a little too small. Let's try 50 and see what we get. I'm going to go ahead and put this in a volume mesher and see what the result looks like, and then we can clean it up and all of that. So I've set it to 50. I'm dropping it in the volume mesher, right? And so now I have this reasonably organic, although it's kind of a little bit wiggly shaped head. So I've got all of these things. They're all unions right now, right? I could always, subtract. Ooh, that's an eye. Let's not subtract an eye. I could always subtract the ears if I wanted to, right? So now he's got a hole through his head with his eyes, right? There's lots of different things I could do to this geometry. But let's go ahead and make that a union. And then let's just go ahead and apply a smooth filter to it, right? And you can see that is, a lot of smoothing. It's really smoothed everything. So let's just go ahead and pull this back a little bit. And you can see that with smoothing, now I can change this so his eyes are still super bugged out, but he's got that little nose and those lumps on the side of his head, right? Now I could add lumps for eyebrows. There's a lot of things I could do to improve this object further. And I could use a couple of these other filters to clean up some of the stuff. So if I do smooth and do a dilate and erode, and I erode it some rather than dilate it, although maybe dilation works too. Let's go ahead and just do a profile view. But if I was to set the offset to -25, right, you can kind of see how I could again use this to control things. Right, and I could make more complex objects that form the basis of these different parts of this model. I could take my two eyes and, oh, sorry, capsule 3 and capsule 2, there we go. I probably should have labeled those, right? I could make the eyes not stick out as much, right? I could have them stick out significantly further, right? They could be up higher on the surface of this. I can always come back in here and say, oh, I actually want, this, right, the nose to be a little bit longer, or to be a little bit fatter on the face, right? And all of this allows me to create, somewhat organic kind of play. In this case, it's like a playful head that we could then put materials on and, turn into a cartoonish kind of character head, right? So these are ways that we can very quickly create organic forms. It's super easy to use a sphere and a cone to make a lemon using this as well. It's like 3 or maybe a minute and a half process if you've used the tool before. And so again, with the volume mesher, right, I could always use that as well. I could always use that to fine tune some of the detail. And again, with the adaptive, in this case, right, I probably want as much geometry as I can have because it's a little bit rough with all those intersections and features without that. Okay, so this has been a tutorial on how to use the volume mesher to build different objects. In the next one, we're going to look at how to use fields and specifically how to use the random field to create a porous object using the volume builder. So stay tuned.